Hey everyone, my name's Ryan from Excel Logics, and welcome to the anatomy of charts in Excel. If you're thinking of biology, it's a little bit different, but kind of the same, because we're going to talk about each individual part, or piece, that makes up an Excel chart. Excel charts can have a surprisingly large number of parts, and each part actually has its own name. In this video, we're going to break down a sample chart into parts, and give you a name for each. Let's go ahead and just make a small practice data set so we can create a chart to work with. Here we'll just put the year, and then we'll just put my savings, for example. And we'll just make it all random. So I'll just put 2019, and let's say for fun I have $5,000 saved. And let's see what's going to happen to my money over time. So to add 1 to the year over time, I'll just select equals this plus 1. And for my savings, I'm going to apply this formula. It's going to be this times 1 plus ran between 1 and 25 divided by 100. So this formula, it multiplies basically my savings above by 1, which retains the full savings amount. And then ran between 1 and 25 will generate a random number between 1 and 25. By dividing it by 100, that random number gets converted to a decimal, such as 0.25 or 0.1. And then, when you multiply it, it's essentially increasing my savings each year by a value between 1% or 25%, depending on the stock market or whatever you have your money in. So I'm going to align that to the left, align this to the left, go ahead and just drag this down, and there we are. And so we kind of have the year, my savings, and then how much I'll have in the future. So by 2055, $5,000, if I have this rate of return, will grow to a lot, $908,000, almost $1 million. So what we'll do now, we'll copy this data and just paste it as static values. Now that it's pasted as static values, what we want to do is go ahead and create our little chart. And with our chart, we're going to start to analyze each piece within the chart. So I'm going to select here, Insert, and you can click a recommended chart if you want to. Just go ahead and highlight your data first. It's probably going to recommend, well, instead of clicking recommended chart, I'm just going to tell you which chart you should use for this data. You should use a line graph because it's a time series. And by time series, I mean the year increases by 1, so the data is continuous, and the savings are continuously growing. In other words, they're not discrete. So between 2019 and 2020, there are values in between that we should be representing. So the proper graph to display this data would definitely be a line chart. I find that sometimes when you insert line charts, it inserts 2 series. So what we're going to want to do now is just break it up. So I'm going to right click on here and go to the select data option. I'll just go here and remove and just start with a blank slate again. My series name is my savings and my series values are all these values. And my category labels, in other words your x-axis labels, are those values there, and select OK. Now what I'm going to do for our video is I'll drag this down so that everything is nice and big and we can just zoom in on the graph and really analyze it. It's not going to let me drag that up anymore, is it? There we go. Okay, I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. Okay, so this is a simple line graph. Now the same holds for a bar graph. So let's explore each piece of this graph. This is your chart title. And to edit the chart title, you can simply click on it and start typing. I'm going to change my chart title to Savings Over Time. Assuming random return of 1 to 25% per annum. Perfect. And then I can just highlight this. Okay, so that is my title. And once you have your title, this whole thing here is just called the chart, or the chart area. Here, this is your grid. So you can drag the grid smaller or bigger within the chart area. So maybe you found like it went too far to the edge. You can go ahead and drag that in a little bit as well. One thing you want to keep in mind when you resize is that here will resize and your labels will resize. So right now I find this to be a little bit tight. So let's go ahead and just talk about the horizontal category axis. I typically call this the x-axis because it's horizontal. And if you think of a Cartesian plane, the horizontal axis is always called your horizontal, and the vertical is always called your vertical or your y-axis. We'll call the horizontal category axis the x-axis. So to align these so they're vertical or so they're rotated, I'm just going to double click on there. Should bring up the format window over here. If you go to this guy here, size and properties, I'm just going to set these to a custom angle. So if I slowly increase the angle, they're going to slowly rotate. I would like them to be rotated the other way. So I'm just going to rotate them -45 degrees. And now it's a little bit easier to read in that they're less scrunched together. So that is your vertical or your horizontal axis, i.e. your x-axis. This axis here, this is your vertical axis. I refer to it as the y-axis because it's vertical. And if you think of a Cartesian plane, your vertical axis is always your y-axis. So if you want to format the vertical axis, you can just double click on it. It will bring up the format axis screen. So say for example we didn't want to see decimals in the numbers there. I can go like this to, I think it's here, number. So the bars, number. You can change the category, change the decimal places, change the symbol, change the formatting. Lots of stuff you can do with your axes. I mean, if you wanted to add like a 3D format, you could do that too. I'm not sure why you would. It might make it harder to read, but who knows. You can also fill it with different colors or whatever, so you could definitely experiment with that. We don't want any fill here. Perfect. So we've gone through our title. Sorry, one sec. Okay, I think he's okay. So that's our title. That is our vertical axis, our horizontal axis. This is your actual line graph. Now this can vary depending on the type of chart that you select. Typically we call it the data series. Here I'm going to call it the line graph. If you have different graphs, we might just call it the pie graph, the pie chart, the 3D bar graph, etc. That just refers to the actual graph that's displayed on your chart. Now, if I double click on the actual thing, I can select specific values and format them. If I hover my mouse over, I can actually, I think it tells you the value. There we are, 2046 value of the savings exactly, 208,178.16. So you can do that. If you want to actually change the color of it, go ahead and make sure that you just click it once. So you have everything selected. Once you have everything selected, go to the paint bucket. And that will allow you to actually fill it with different colors. And you can apply different weights to make the line thicker, whatever you think suits your data best. I think green might work well since we're talking about money. Money is usually referred to as green, but who knows. And then I'm going to go ahead and drag this up a little bit, make it a bit smaller. Let's talk about the legend. This is the legend at the bottom. So if I had two different accounts, for example, you could have like multiple different lines here, like one for your checking account, one for your savings account, maybe like one for your mortgage that starts like around 500,000 and then slowly dissipates down over 25 years. So you could overlay all these different series onto your chart. And that's totally fine. That looks great. It definitely gives the user a lot more stuff to read off of your chart. What else should we talk about? The grid lines. These are major grid lines because these align directly with the values here on my vertical axis. So what you want to do is just double click on the grid lines. It will give you a bunch of options. So if you wanted to like change the color of your grid lines, you can do so. Now if you wanted to add minor grid lines, I'll show you how to do that. you can just select the whole chart area here, go to the Design tab, and click Add Chart Element. You see the drop down here where it says grid lines. You can add minor horizontal grid lines. So it just gives the user a bit more ability to kind of literally read between the lines. So they can say, okay, this looks like 320, 340, 360, 380, 400,000. So it's divided up the range from 3 to 400,000 and 4 to 5 and so on into $20,000 increments. So it's easier to just read along and see, when is my savings account going to hit 420,000? Well, it's going to hit that about here, which appears to be about 2051. So maybe halfway through 2051 or a quarter of the way through, my savings account is hitting $420,000. So that's how you can add and modify major grid lines as well as minor grid lines. The last element of the chart, it's not visual, but let me just show you. So if you right click on here, you can select this, select data. And this is probably the most important screen. So this is going to show you, it's going to highlight with like this moving green line around the data set that you've selected. So I can see that I have my savings, and if I click the edit function here, it's just going to highlight the series name and then the series values that are contained in the chart. I accidentally selected that. Let me just cancel. And then if you click here, edit, those are your labels. So you can change them to be like whatever you want them to be. But yeah, that's basically how it works. And that's kind of the anatomy, not kind of, that is the anatomy of all of the elements that make up a chart. If you select different charts, they're all still going to have the same elements, slightly different. I think a line graph depicts it really well. The most frequently used graphs are like line graphs, histogram, bar graph, and pie chart. So they all share these common characteristics in their anatomy. And now you kind of know what to call each thing. So you can go ahead and play with that. Before we end the video, I'll just quickly talk about some other things you can add to the anatomy or to the body of your chart. So you can go Add Chart Element. We talked about the axes, talked about the axes titles. Of course, you can also label the vertical. Let me add that in now, because I didn't do that before. This should be labeled. Proper charts usually have both axes labeled. So this would be my savings account value. And you can move it. This would be the year. And in this case, if I want to follow through with this graph and make it proper, I'm actually going to delete the legend because we only have one series here. So we don't actually have a need for the legend. But it's important to know what the legend looks like and be able to modify it if you need to. So you can definitely like go ahead and like close this or delete it, or you can change the text, you can even change the colors. In this case, we don't need it. I'm just going to remove it. Again, click on the graph, select the design drop-down. You can add more stuff. So if you wanted to add a data table, you can do that as well. With legend keys, literally going to show you all of the values within your chart. So I'll just show you how that looks here. Obviously, everything's like really tight in the data table. Let me just like make it bigger. It's not letting me. It's not letting me make it bigger. But basically, oh, I think I just have to do this. 1 second. Almost. You can see that like all the values in my table are just too big for the data table. So the data table here doesn't really fit working with this type of data very well. But you can see that what the goal of the data table is to do, it's to actually display the raw data that you see up here in pink and blue on your graph. So 2019 value of my savings account was 5,000. 2020 it was 5250. And these actually all line up with the values on your chart. So it works really nicely. But as we just saw, the downside is that when your savings account or whatever you're measuring hits big values, it's hard to actually fit them all within the data table. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that. To remove it, just select the Design tab, Add Chart Element, data table, we'll just click none and it's gone. More stuff you can add to your chart. Error bars, if you have errors, you can display like standard errors, percentage errors, or standard deviations. And you can actually select like the data set specific to those bars. Grid lines, we talked about the grid lines. You could also add major horizontal or minor vertical, both major vertical or minor vertical. I don't see why we need to add those now. It seems pretty easy to read to the user, but definitely something to think about depending on the data that you're working with. Legend, we talk about the legend. You can place it in different areas on your graph. Totally depends on like what you're working with, where you want it. You can add different lines to drop down from your graph so it's easy to identify where it lines up to. Might be useful here to select a specific year easily. And lastly, the last thing we can add is a trend line. Here, in this case, I'm not sure if it makes sense to add a trend line because we're already looking at a trend in the savings account. But definitely if you're modeling something else, you'll be using linear, exponential, or linear forecasts to kind of figure out what's the trend in my data, what's the R-squared value, how well does the regression line fit my data set. And lastly, the up-down bars. These are just bars that are going to kind of go between two different, so if you had two series here, you can add bars between the two series. And yeah, that's basically everything that you need to know about the anatomy of an Excel graph. So don't forget to use the proper names when you have a chance, and you'll sound like an Excel pro. If you have any questions about the anatomy of charts in Excel, please feel free to contact us. Our email is support@excellogics.org.